Cool, welcome guys to another research review. It is week number 11, and this week we have Stephanie Lazarczuk with us. I hope I've said that correctly. I did practice before this call, and basically the research she's going to go over is her research into kicking injuries. It's titled The Epidemiology of Kicking Injuries in Professional Rugby Union, a 15-season prospective study. I struggled to get that out. I do apologize. I was focused more on the surname. So, Steph, floor's over to you. Do you want to give us a little bit more about yourself and your general areas of research and pre-research, what you do outside of research, etc.?
Sure. So by trade, I'm a sport rehabilitator, and I also have a master's in strength and conditioning. So hopefully those complement quite nicely in terms of our clinical practice. More recently, I've been lecturing at St Mary's in Twickenham, but also previous to that and slightly during as well, I've also worked clinically in football or soccer, depending on where you're from, obviously rugby, cricket, a bit in ice hockey, and then some private clinic work and a few years as a rehab instructor for the military as well. So a bit of a combination of academia and clinical work. And then obviously around this, we've done some research, which is why we're here.
Nice. And why did you go down the route that you went down with this paper, Steph? How did it come about? How did the research question come about?
So some people will call me crazy, but this was part of a second master's that I did, which was a master's by research. So originally the position had been advertised, and it was obviously focused around rugby kicking. I quite like that idea. I'm interested in rugby. I'll happily sit there and watch it all day. So I obviously applied, and then I started working with Dr. Neil Bezodis, who you're obviously aware of from some of the previous work that you talked about. And obviously with my background, I've got more of a focus on injuries, which is probably understandable from the rehab perspective. So I obviously wanted to try and target that element a little bit more, whereas maybe some of the previous studies have looked a little bit more at performance factors or the actual biomechanical technique that people use, particularly during place kicking. So in order to try and expand that a little bit, we're like, okay, well, where do maybe some of the risks feature within rugby kicking? Now, obviously, place kicking is only one part of it. So the question then was, well, what happens in the others as well? But in order to determine how we went about that, we end up with this paper, which was actually originally two separate chapters that we combined to give you the most amount of information possible. And essentially we wanted to go, okay, well, if we're going to focus somewhere, because you can't just say we're going to look at absolutely everything through the body in 7 different types of kick. That's fairly ridiculous as a research question. So the epidemiology aspect came about to focus our attention on a specific area. And then looking at the match kicking analysis data was obviously then to narrow down to say, okay, what groups of kicks are there across a match to make it a bit more meaningful rather than kind of just plucking things out of the air. So that's effectively where this paper has come from.
Nice.
Okay, and so with this paper, exactly what were your objectives from, and what were you really trying to find out from this paper specifically, Steph?
Yeah, so there was basically 2 parts. So the first part was to provide a more thorough description of the epidemiology of injuries that were directly attributable to kicking. So
yes,
there has been extensive research done around epidemiology in Rugby Union, and kicking has sometimes been a part of that, but generally it gets put into a section of other with some different match events. So we wanted to focus specifically on kicking itself. And then the second part to it was also to look at the specific position effects as well. So both in terms of the volume of kicking across matches, professional matches anyway, and also the types of kick that they perform during that exposure. So we could sort of better understand some of those differences in the exposure and what they're doing while they are actually kicking.
Cool. Well, 15 seasons of injury surveillance sounds like a lot of data, Steph. So if you could you talk us through your kind of methodology, how you approached answering these questions?
Sure. So 15 seasons is generally quite a lot. Obviously kicking's a little bit more niche, so I lucked out a little bit. If I'd chosen something like contact injuries, there'd have been a lot more to look at. But we were very lucky in that we had buy-in from like the RFU and Premiership Rugby, where we could get access to the PRISP, which is the Professional Rugby Injury Surveillance Project. And now that's been running for many, many seasons. So we were able to then extract any injuries that have been coded as having kicking as the mechanism, which obviously then narrowed it down for us. And then for the match analysis data, we were able to get 2 seasons worth of their data from there as well, in order to basically do that side of the study. And the kicks were coded with both the type of kick that were performed and the playing position that performed that kick. So those 2 things came quite nicely. So within that, what we were able to do is then kind of split it down into different sections and say, okay, well, we want to look at injury rates as an overall for the squad, in line with other research, using incidents per 1,000 player hours or athlete exposures, depending on the term you're more familiar with. And also to kind of give an overview of what happens if you then look at a specific section, because even anecdotally, if you've ever watched rugby, you'll know that the majority of the kicks are performed by the backs. So where traditional incidence is calculated using all 15 players in a team or 30 players on a pitch, that's obviously not going to be representative of this match task. And also within the backs, it's unlikely that all of them perform kicking equally. So even using that as a method of providing an injury rate isn't necessarily always the best. So what we also wanted to look at was the propensity of injury, like per kick. So based on the actual match event itself, rather than just as a unit of time. We were obviously able to pull out from the PRISP the diagnoses, the types of injury sustained, as well as the locations, based on the way that they're put in using the Orchard injury codes. Also time in match, which is obviously quite important if you're going to look at how you condition somebody across a game. The common kick types obviously were a major part of the match analysis data. And like I said, you also had the position as well that were performing those kicks. So when we were then able to combine the 2 aspects of the epidemiology and the match analysis data in order to give us these propensity calculations. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we went about this.
All right. So, yeah, I would love to get each example of the forwards. I mean, they've got 2.6% with the number of kicks. I would love to know which forwards they were and what they were doing. It's
interesting. Brush a blood to the head, maybe.
So, and then what did you find, Steph? I mean, there were a couple of things that I found interesting, but I'll let you obviously speak to it. What were, as a quick snapshot, what were the 2 or 3 things that you really found interesting from the data you obtained?
Yeah, so we ended up focusing more on the match injuries rather than training injuries, because match injuries were 22 times more frequent than training injuries. So whatever people are doing in training appears to be working. They don't tend to get injured too much during that. When we then looked at the injury rates, if you use the traditional incidence values, it was 0.7 per 1,000 hours. If you limit that to only the backs, obviously it's pretty much double, 1.4 per 1,000 hours. And then the propensity itself is obviously something that we were really interested in finding, which was then 0.57 per 1,000 kicks, as opposed to, like we said, that unit per time. When we then looked at the time in match, I thought one of the things that was really interesting to me was that more, let's break it down a little bit further. So in line with most of the other rugby research, the 3rd quarter of the game is the more injurious section within the match. So that fits in with pretty much everything that exists. But what I found really interesting was that during the warm-up, more people got injured during the warm-up kicking than either during the 1st or the 2nd quarters. So obviously, given that a warm-up is supposed to prepare you to play, ideally you shouldn't be getting injured during that time frame. So that was something that I found really quite interesting within there. Somewhat as you might expect, the lower limb was the most injured location or limb within the body, with 92% of all match injuries happened sort of pelvis and lower limb, and within that 78% were over on the kicking side. So if we were going to focus our attention, then obviously the kicking limb is where we would go. The muscle and tendon injuries tend to be the most common, and particularly within that kicking thigh as well. So 21% of all match injuries were sustained by the rec fem, which is quite large given that it's just one muscle within the entire body to have 1/5 of your injuries within that. But generally, or more generally, the quadriceps were the location that were injured the most, followed by hamstrings, followed by adductors. So there's obviously variation around the thigh. Why that is, we don't necessarily know. As we said, the vast majority of kicks were performed by the backs, and about half of all of the match kicks were performed by that fly half, with the scrum half providing about another quarter, and then the remaining quarter sort of obviously distributed amongst different positions that were left over, effectively. Punt kicks are the most frequent type, but if you have a little scroll down to figure 3 for me, then you can show that obviously there's quite a difference in terms of the distribution of types of kick. So about 3/4 of the scrum halves match kicks were made up from just box kicks alone, which again you might expect if you've ever watched rugby, whereas the fly half, who's performing about half of all of the match kicks, had a much greater sort of distribution of types of kick. But punt kicks were a consistent theme across all of the positions. Now the forwards tended to be more of sort of grubbers along the floor, or they're hacking at the ball when it's already on the floor, so that's probably fairly intuitive as well, but that's where their consent comes from. And then obviously propensity was the element that we really wanted to try and get into. So while the fly half performed about half of the match kicks, they also sustained about half of the injuries. So they had what was determined to be an average propensity for injury. And again, you might expect that, given that if they've got a higher exposure, they're probably going to have a higher injury rate. But then when you look at the scrum half, who does about half as much of them, so about a quarter of all the match kicks, their injury rates were actually sort of less than 10%. So their proportions of injuries were quite low. So in terms of their propensity for injury, they're very low. So clearly there's a difference between our playing positions in terms of who's sustaining the injuries in relation to how much they're kicking. Obviously the remaining positions tended not to kick as much as these other two, but when they did, they had higher injury rates, so they would be then categorized as having a high propensity for injury. So overall, what that sort of demonstrates to us is that there really are these position-specific effects of kicking in rugby union. So if you're dealing with those people who do actually kick, then this is obviously maybe some useful information to consider when you're planning sort of training strategies or general prep, and if you're going to focus on some of their position-specific demands, as it were, for the game. And it might even be that if you've got somebody returning to kicking from injury, that this also provides some information too. But the nutshell then is that fly halves do the most kicking. They get injured more frequently than anybody else. When people do get injured kicking, it tends to be the quadriceps and specifically rectum of that kicking thigh. So those are the real nutshell take homes from the research, I would say.
Nice. I mean, it's obviously it's a really comprehensive review, Steph. But I mean, where do you see the future research lying? What further questions do you have now following the research that you conducted that you feel may need to be answered going forward?
Yeah, one of the things that I get asked quite a lot is which kick types lead to injury more frequently, and we don't have that information. So we had the two data sets were separate. We've combined them to give these estimates of things like propensity. So something that would be particularly useful is to actually have those injuries coded with the type of kick that happened at the time. So if you know all of the injuries are occurring while somebody's punt kicking, or they're all occurring when somebody's goal kicking, then that obviously tells you something about why maybe they're getting injured as well. But then you can go into huge amounts of depth with that question, with the why, in relation to the biomechanical breakdown. Like, what is the technique? How does that differ? What does that mean in terms of muscle lengthening or rate of lengthening? Where are you getting that sort of intensity from during those kicks? So there's lots of ways that it could be taken, but there's obviously going to be some unanswered questions at the moment.
And just one more question. As a rehabilitator in practice, how would you go about returning a fly half from a rec fem injury when the injury had been caused by a kick? How would you go about tracking the kicking load that they are subject to in training?
Well, as much as pretty much any other injury, like, everything would need to be progressive, right? So at the point where they're able to perform a technique at a sub-maximal level, pain-free, then obviously you can start building it up. So if I use baseball as an example, where I've had some conversations with some of their therapists recently about their return to throw post elbow post shoulder, it pretty much mirrors it in that, you know, you start maybe kicking or throwing over a short distance with less intensity, and then progressively you're increasing both the volume of kicks or throws, but you're also then starting to increase the distance. And, you know, if you're just going through the motions versus really putting in the emphasis, then that obviously is a very different skill that you're performing. Also, you know, with these different types of kick, now we've got this breakdown to go, okay, well, across a match, this is kind of how the fly halves kicks are distributed. So they need to be able to perform restarts, they need to be able to perform drop kicks, they need to be able to, you know, actually kick for goal or put a hang chase up in the air. So then you can start to amalgamate some of these things to go, okay, well, we need to do a little bit of this and a little bit of this, but they do a lot of this, so we need to focus a little bit more there because that's their kind of bread and butter, and these are the things that tie in with our game demands as well. So having those sorts of conversations with the technical coaches as well is going to be important, because obviously if you return someone and go, okay, we're going to really focus on their punt kicks for distance because we know they do a lot of those, but actually they don't want to play a kicking game the week that they returned, and then that's obviously not the best use of your time. So there's lots of things that would feed into your program, but obviously progressive increases in volume, progressive increases in distance is probably where I would start my thinking process.
All right, fascinating. So, yeah, the one question I want to ask, you might not have the answer to, so I do apologize for putting you on the spot, but you might have the codes to it. I noticed one bone fracture or stress fracture. Can you remember, was that in the foot or high up the chain, or are you allowed to give that information away?
Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure it was foot related.
Okay.
So whether that's an acute fracture or whether it was bony stress, I cannot remember based on the data, but I'm reasonably confident it was somewhere down in the foot. So
cool.
I would assume that's also kicking side as well.
Yes. So yeah, I've just found that fascinating because you wouldn't expect there to be enough force really, unless he's kicked a lot in the past couple of weeks. To have a stress fracture. But as I say, we're not too sure what it was, but I just found that fascinating. All right.
Yeah, well, that probably also ties in with, you know, what we don't also know is how kicking relates to the other match demands. So how does it relate to, if you've done lots of kicking or lots of sprints first and then you kick, or you do several kicks and then you sprint, you know, things like that. So obviously with that one person, the other demands and how those all fit together, that would obviously be a factor,
Yes. Yeah, it's also interesting. I would have loved to know how they determined that that fracture was from that kick, because obviously it was for a kick. So it could have happened before without, you know, showing symptoms potentially, because, you know, obviously, especially in the back, you might have some fractures without any pain. So yeah, fascinating. We can get to a rabbit hole down that. But Steph, I just want, from our side, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking time to go through it. Fascinating study, really interesting area of research that I think yourself, Neil, and Alex Atack, etc., there's a lack of research into kicking, whether it's injuries, biomechanics, and it's such an important part of the game, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you for your time. And guys, once again, this should be up on all our channels. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Any feedback's welcome. And Steph, once again, thank you, and we'll chat to you soon.
Thank you.